A homeless man stopped Michael Jordan on the street, asking for just $1. What happened next left the entire crowd completely stunned. It was one of those great afternoons in downtown Cincinnati, the kind where the sky threatened to rain, but never fully kept the promise. The air felt thick with the smell of wet pavement and fast food grease, a mix of the city's pulse and its silent neglect. Pedestrians moved with the usual rhythm, some with purpose, others lost in their own world, and a few, like Michael Jordan, caught somewhere in between. Jordan walked at a steady pace, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Dressed casually, he didn't stand out much, just another man blending into the city. But even without flashy attire, people noticed him. He caught a few glances, generating whispers among the passers-by. Some recognized him from TV, others from headlines. His name carried weight, but at that moment, he was just a guy walking past a row of aging storefronts, dodging the occasional scooter abandoned on the sidewalk. Then, from the side, a voice cut through the city noise. "Hey man, can you spare me $1?" It wasn't the first time Jordan had heard those words. He'd spent plenty of time in places like that, familiar with the regular rhythm of street requests. Usually, a quick nod or a polite greeting would suffice before he moved on. But something about this man made him slow his step. Maybe it was the way his voice faltered, or the fact that he didn't immediately make eye contact. The man was thin, but not just the way hunger wears someone down. It was the kind of thinness that settled in the face, hollowing out the cheeks and making the eyes appear larger than they should be. His clothes were a mismatched blend of layers, worn more for survival than for style. His beard was uneven, more neglected than intentional, and his hands were cracked from exposure to the elements. He wasn't aggressive or insistent, just standing there, waiting, as if he'd made that request 1,000 times before and didn't expect anything. When Jordan stopped, the man blinked, surprised. This wasn't how it usually played out. Usually, it was a bill falling into the palm of his hand or a stranger walking away. "What's your name?" Jordan asked. The man hesitated, cleared his throat, and murmured, "George." Jordan studied him for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Around them, people passed by, barely noticing the scene. For most, it was just another interaction between a famous person and a man most would ignore. But there was something about George that kept Jordan rooted there. Maybe it was the way his shoulders drooped slightly, not in defeat, but in exhaustion. Or maybe it was the fact that despite everything, George approached with a kind of quiet dignity. He wasn't demanding, he wasn't pleading, he was just asking. "Do you live around here?" Jordan asked. George let out a short laugh, but without humor. "I live where I can. You know how it is." Jordan nodded, but didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he asked, "How long have you been here?" George shifted, looking out at the street, as if pondering whether to keep talking or just leave. "A long time," he finally answered. Jordan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool air. He felt eyes on him now. Someone had stopped nearby, perhaps listening, perhaps recording. He wasn't sure, and, to be honest, it didn't matter. What he said next, however, did. George shoved his hands into the pockets of his oversized jacket. The fabric seemed stiff, its original color long faded to something between brown and gray. His fingers curled inside the fabric, grasping at nothing, as if the act of moving them was what kept them warm. Jordan stayed there, still studying him. Most famous people would have already walked away, or, at best, tossed a few dollars to the man before moving on. But Jordan didn't reach for his wallet, and George noticed that. His expression wavered for a second, between expectation and disappointment, as if he had already rehearsed this outcome in his mind. "I just need $1, George repeated, this time in a quieter tone, as if lowering the amount might change the answer. Jordan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out at the street, where a small group of people had begun to watch the scene. A man leaning against a light post pretended to check his phone, while a woman holding a grocery bag slowed her pace. A few meters away, a teenager lingered with his hands shoved in the front pocket of his hoodie, his eyes flicking back and forth between George and Jordan. The city had a peculiar way of turning private moments into public spectacles. Jordan looked back at George. "What would you do with this money?" George snorted, something between a laugh and a sneer. "That's not the question they usually ask," he muttered. But Jordan wasn't joking. His expression remained serious. George's face hardened a little. $1 doesn't get you much nowadays," he murmured. "Maybe a coffee, maybe a piece of bread if you know where to go." He paused and, in an even quieter voice, added, "Or maybe just a moment when I don't feel like nothing." Something in the tone of the last sentence weighed in the air between them. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't pleading. It was true that Michael Jordan's jaw tightened. He looked at George's hands again, still stuffed in the pockets of his jacket, fingers shifting as if trying to grasp something invisible. "Did you used to work?" Michael Jordan asked. George let out another laugh, though this one was bitter. "Yeah, before life got in the way." Michael Jordan nodded slightly. "What was the job?" George hesitated and shrugged. "Plumber. Not exactly fancy. Mostly residential work, fixing leaking pipes, broken water heaters, replacing stuff." He shook his head. "Not much demand for a guy without a permanent address, though." Michael Jordan didn't argue. He'd heard stories like this before. Some people fell through the cracks so fast they barely had time to brace for the impact. George rubbed his chin, his fingers brushing against his stubbled face. "So, are you going to give me $1 or what?" Another pause. Michael Jordan's answer wasn't what anyone expected. "I'll give you something better." George's forehead furrowed. "Man, I'm not asking for a sermon." "It's not a sermon," Michael Jordan said. George looked at him, tired. Around them, the noise of the street seemed to quiet down a little, as if the city were waiting to see what would happen next. But whatever Michael Jordan had in mind, it wasn't going to be simple. George narrowed his eyes, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He had been here before. Conversations that started like this usually ended with some lecture on self-improvement, bootstraps, or personal responsibility. He braced for the same. But Michael Jordan didn't launch into a speech. He simply asked, "When was the last time someone gave you a real chance?" George furrowed his brow. "What kind of work?" Like anything, the question caught him off guard. He blinked and looked past Michael Jordan, as if searching for an answer in the urban landscape behind him. He let out a slow sigh, shaking his head. "It's been a while." Michael Jordan nodded, as if already knowing the answer. "Have you ever tried getting off the streets?" George shot him a look. "Man, what kind of question is that?" Michael Jordan didn't flinch. George scoffed, rubbing the side of his face. "You think I want to be here? You think this is some kind of choice?" Michael Jordan stayed quiet, letting him talk. "I've tried shelters," George continued. "Half of them are full before I even walk through the door. I've tried working. You know what they tell me? Come back when you have a phone. Come back when you have an address." He let out a humorless laugh. "Like I can just pull that out of thin air." Michael Jordan crossed his arms, listening. George shook his head. "You ever been homeless?" "Number." Michael Jordan smiled. "Yes. Didn't think so." Michael Jordan tilted his head slightly. "But I've been poor." George looked at him differently now, still skeptical, but maybe a little less disdainful. "Yeah." Michael Jordan nodded. "I grew up in a house where sometimes the heat didn't work, where the fridge was almost empty. I know what it's like to go to school wearing the same clothes for 2-3 days in a row. George sniffed, rubbing his nose with the back of his hand. Yeah, well, I bet you had an out. Michael Jordan held his gaze. It took a while. A beat of silence stretched between them. Around them, the small crowd had grown, and people were watching. A man with a baseball cap raised his phone, pretending to check messages, but clearly recording the scene. A woman whispered something to her friend, her eyes shifting between Michael Jordan and George. George exhaled sharply. So what? You going to sit here and tell me to get up, that I just need to work harder? Michael Jordan shook his head, but George narrowed his eyes. And then what? Michael Jordan took something out of his jacket pocket, but it wasn't money. It was a small folded piece of paper. He held it out to George, who looked at it with suspicion. What is this? A name? A number? Michael Jordan didn't answer immediately, but said, For someone who can help. George gave him a look of disbelief. How do they run a first housing program? No strings attached. George mocked. Yeah, right. It's not that easy. Michael Jordan didn't lower his hand. No, it's not. But it's real. George hesitated. He had been promised empty words before. Flyers for shelters that were already full. Program numbers with waiting lists months long. He wasn't sure if this was any different, but something in Michael Jordan's face, the way he wasn't smiling, the way he wasn't trying to sell anything, made George pause. Why are you doing this? George asked. Michael Jordan's answer was simple. Because someone once did this for me. George swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Michael Jordan and the paper in his hand. But he wasn't the only one watching, and not everyone agreed with what was happening. George looked at the folded paper in Michael Jordan's hand as if it were a loaded question. He had seen handouts before, flyers for worn-out soup kitchens, business cards from social workers who never answered their phones, crumpled church flyers offering prayers instead of solutions. But something about this moment felt different. George finally reached out and took the paper, but not without a skeptical look. He unfolded it with rough fingers, his hands unsteady from the cold. The name written inside meant nothing to him, and the number didn't either. It could be real, or it could be another dead end. He exhaled sharply through his nose. So this is it? He looked at Michael Jordan. A few people in the small crowd scoffed. Someone murmured something quietly. The man with the baseball cap adjusted his phone, still recording. Michael Jordan remained calm. If $1 really helped? George let out a bitter laugh. It wouldn't hurt. Michael Jordan held his gaze. It wouldn't change anything either. George gritted his teeth. Man, I'm not asking you to save me, just asking for a damn dollar. Another mockery came from the crowd. A woman next to him shook her head and murmured, Just give him the money, man. Michael Jordan ignored the voices. His focus was on George. You said you used to work before plumbing rights? George exhaled sharply. Yeah. And what about it? Michael Jordan grabbed his phone. There's a guy I know. He runs a hiring business in Dayton. He's always looking for workers. He'll give people who need a second chance a shot. George squinted at him. Are you serious? Michael Jordan nodded. I'll make the call. You show up, you work, you get paid, no games. The crowd stirred. The hoodie-wearing teenager whispered something to his friend. A man near the curb, who had been watching in silence, shook his head and murmured, Politicians, man. Always a stunt. George let out a dry laugh. So, let me get this straight. I asked for $1, and you're trying to give me a job? Michael Jordan's expression didn't change. I'm trying to give you a way out. George looked at him for a long moment, his grip tightening on the piece of paper. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, waiting to see what he'd say, waiting to see if he'd accept the offer or tell Michael Jordan to go to hell. Someone in the crowd finally snapped, "Is this some kind of joke?" The voice came from a man in his 40s, standing near the curb with a canvas bag hanging from his arm. His face was full of skepticism, and his mouth curled in disbelief. "He didn't ask for a job interview," the man continued. "He asked for a damn dollar, a cup of coffee. You really think a guy living on the streets can just show up for a job like that?" Some others murmured in agreement. Michael Jordan didn't look away from George. "You tell me," he said. George's mouth was dry, his fingers twisted at his side. He had been stuck in this life for so long that he wasn't sure he knew how to want something different. More. The paper felt like it was burning a hole in his hand. And then he did something no one expected. George's fingers curled around the paper as if he were holding something fragile, something he wasn't sure belonged to him. His breath seemed heavy in his chest. A job. A real shot. Not a dollar, not a pity pat on the shoulder, something bigger, and yet the weight of all the eyes on him made his skin itch. He could feel the judgment rolling in. The people around, those who weren't homeless, who had homes to go back to, warm beds, and lives that didn't involve begging for change. "Are you going to take it or what?" asked the man with the grocery bag, challenged, his voice sharp, something between disbelief and irritation. George shot him a look as if saying, "What's that got to do with you?" The man scoffed, shifting the weight of his bag. "What's that got to do with me? I've seen guys like you 100 times. Always an excuse, always a reason why something isn't good enough." George's jaw clenched. "You don't know anything about me." The guy laughed dryly. "I know you haven't worked in years. I know you're here begging instead of trying, and I know you're not about to accept that offer." He shook his head. "And if you do, you'll quit the second it gets hard." The words hit harder than George wanted to admit. His grip on the paper tightened. He wanted to tell the guy to shove it, to say he didn't know what the hell he was talking about. But the truth was, a small part of George wondered if he still had it in him. If he could wake up at 5 in the morning, push through the exhaustion, show up and prove it to himself. And then there was the other side of it, the one that whispered, "What if this is just another lie?" He turned to Michael Jordan, his eyes filled with something unreadable. "And what happens if this is bullshit? What if I show up and they don't have anything for me?" Michael Jordan didn't blink. "Then you call me." George narrowed his eyes. "Call you?" Michael Jordan nodded, holding up the phone. "I don't give people my number lightly, but if you show up and they don't give you work, you call me, and I'll find you something else." A murmur passed through the small crowd. The hoodie-wearing teenager whispered, "Yo, this is real for his friend." The man with the grocery bag scoffed, but didn't say anything more. George felt his heart pounding in his chest. It was so real. He had spent so much time waiting for people to ignore him, to avoid his gaze, to pretend he didn't exist. But now, this was all a job, a lifeline that terrified him. He swallowed hard. "I don't even have a phone." Michael Jordan didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black burner phone. He handed it to George. "Now you do." The crowd fell silent. A few sighs. Someone murmured, "No way." George stared at the phone as if it were a foreign object, his breath irregular. No one had ever done something like this for him before. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more intense, someone in the crowd spoke and turned everything upside down. "Is this all for show?" A voice cut through the moment like a blade. George's grip on the phone tightened. His heart, which had been beating with something close to hope, clenched at the accusation. The man who had spoken was older, maybe in his mid-50s, with a salt and pepper beard and a worn flannel shirt. He seemed gruff, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Is this some kind of political stunt?" His voice was full of suspicion. "Cameras are rolling, people are watching. And suddenly, here you are saving a homeless guy. What happens when they stop watching?" Murmurs rippled through the spectators. Some nodded in agreement, others seemed uncertain. Michael Jordan met the man's gaze without flinching. "You think I did this for attention?" The man scoffed. "Isn't that what politicians do?" George looked between them, something twisting in his gut. He didn't want to believe that. He didn't want to think that he was just another pawn in someone else's story. But that familiar doubt, so deeply ingrained, crawled back. Michael Jordan didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself with flashy words. He simply said, "What I did today doesn't change just because people are watching. If you think it does, that says more about the world you've seen than about me." The man in flannel didn't respond immediately. He just shook his head, murmuring something quietly before walking away. A woman in the crowd spoke up next. "So, what happens now?" George blinked, realizing that the question was directed at him now. The question shook in his chest. He had the phone, he had the number, he had the chance, but was he really going to take it? He licked his lips, glancing at the burner phone one more time before slipping it into his pocket. "I guess I make a call," he murmured. It was the smallest commitment he could make, just a call, just a first step. Michael Jordan nodded. "That's all you have to do." George shifted his weight. "What if I screw it up?" "You try again." George let out a slow breath. He didn't know if this would change his life. He didn't know if this was just another false hope or the real deal. But for the first time in a long time, he had something. A name, a phone number, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance. Michael Jordan took a step back, giving him space. No pressure, no theatrics, just a simple truth left hanging in the air. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera clicked off. Some people drifted away, shaking their heads, still debating whether what they had just witnessed was real or not. But for George, it didn't matter what they thought. It wasn't about them. It was about whether he was ready to fight for himself again. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked away. This time, with something in his pocket. This wasn't just another empty promise. Not all opportunities come the way we expect. Some don't come at all, but when they do, when someone reaches out and says, "I see you," the hardest part is not accepting the help. It's believing you deserve it. Maybe George makes that call, maybe he doesn't. But the lesson here isn't about a guaranteed outcome. It's about what happens when we stop assuming people are beyond saving and start treating them as though they still matter. If this story made you think, share it. You never know who might need to hear it today. And if you've ever had a second chance, leave a comment below. Because sometimes, knowing that someone else survived is all the hope a person needs.